It feels really good. I'm really pleased to be back. It was, I think, writing The Siege of Terror, which was the series just prior to this one, was, I think, the highlight of my professional career. It was a fantastic experience working with some talented people. The writers' rooms were fantastic. We sort of threw ideas around, and it was just exhilarating to be part of that. And I wrote one of those Siege of Terror novels. And so to come back and do a similar kind of exercise where we're working with a multi-author series, trying to kick around ideas and think what's really special about this period of history, but in a different time with its own kind of interesting features, its own aspects, that was great. And I wasn't going to say no to that. It's a big book. I think that's the first thing to say. It tries to cover an awful lot of ground. I think when we started thinking about this series, I went back to Horus Rising, which was the first book of the Heresy series, and sort of thought very hard about. That's a fantastic book. It's a fantastic story, but it also sets up a series really well. It introduces characters that we know about from the lore, but also original characters that have particular purposes in the plots that are going to unfold. So I thought quite hard about doing something similar, kind of introducing characters, some of which we know about, some of which we know nothing about, to really create a new world. And this is a new period of history for Warhammer. It's not a rerun of the Heresy, and it's certainly not a 40k book. This is own time period. And so thinking about how that was done before, and then thinking about how we can do that in this setting, and create not just a new cast of characters, a new series of events, but a different tone. And that felt really important. Like, what is the Scouring sort of almost spiritually for these people, and certainly, you know, the way they feel about the universe and what's going on, so that when you're reading this, you feel like you're transported to something that we don't know very much about, and it's a new experience, and it's something that hopefully kind of enriches our understanding of what the Warhammer Galaxy is. It felt really important to examine the psychological effects of what they've just been through by the time we get to this story. So the action takes place relatively quickly after the end of the siege, so that all the events of that period are really fresh in people's minds, and there are some flashback scenes where we actually see them emerge from that kind of period of complete destruction. And so thinking about how they would respond to that, and there are very different kinds of characters. There are some Space Marines, there are some non-Space Marines, there are some people right at the top of the hierarchy of both sides, and there are some people right at the bottom. They're all going to respond differently, and they're all going to be profoundly affected by it. So even people who have lived through the Heresy period and are now into the Scouring period, they're not the same people anymore. They've been completely changed by this. So for every character that appears in the book, the first question was, how are they going to deal with this? What are the things they're going to do, and what are they going to think about the way forward? Are they even thinking about a way forward? Are they completely destroyed by what's happened? Or are they able to kind of construct something? So that psychological side was really important. And I suppose allied to that, one of the things I love about Warhammer is it's not just about the physical battle. It's not about just the armies and the bolters and the swords. There's also a spiritual side in terms of their relationship to the gods, what they think about the gods, what they think about the metaphysics of the universe, which are really real for all these people. And that's another key element that, as the book goes on, people have to change their views, or their views are threatened by what's just happened. They may have come into the Heresy with a whole set of beliefs, and they're now in a situation where those beliefs don't work anymore, or they've changed. And so that was really interesting for me as well. I think that people's first instinct will be to grieve for what's lost, and just as much on the traitor side. From the Imperial point of view, we call them traitors, but they've lost as more, I think, than the Imperials in some respects. But they've got no time to grieve, which is one of the themes of the book as well. That what they might want to do is actually sit down and reflect for a long time about this. They might think about what they've lost, the things they hope to gain that they're no longer going to get. But because of the nature of this very violent universe where things move very quickly, and because of the narrative drive of the Scouring, it's essentially the time where the Imperium pushes the traitors back out. Nobody really has time to sit down properly and think about those. They're always kind of improvising. On the Imperial side, we follow two Space Marines. There's one called Titus Praetor, who is a character from the Heresy series, who was introduced in Unremembered Empire, I think. He's a senior Ultramarine, he's a librarian. And he comes in with that kind of that great kind of saving ride of the Legion that kind of saved the day on Terra. So he wasn't fighting on the ground during the siege. He comes in as a newcomer. He's had his own battles, but they're not on Terra. And he is sort of paired with, in terms of the characters, an Imperial Fist character called Arcamus, or Arcamus. We have some dispute over how to pronounce that. And he was there during the siege, and he has lived through it. And he is presented with a very different outlook at the beginning of the book. His Legion is in much worse shape than the Ultramarines, who are much more cohesive. They have an enormous amount of prestige on the Loyalist side because they were there when it mattered and they held the line, but they don't have the same kind of physical resource that the Ultramarines have. Their Primarchs turned up all these ships and all these armies. So there's a real mismatch in how that works out. And of course, that creates tensions. It's quite interesting to explore how they work. They're very much the opposite ends of the Imperial war machine, I guess, in terms of where they've ended up in the siege. As you say, the Ultramarines weren't there. They come very late to the party. And I think that for the citizens of Terra, there's a real mix of emotions about that. There's a sense, well, you guys have come in and saved the situation, but you weren't really here when it was at its toughest, and you haven't seen the things that we've seen. And now you've come in with all your resources and all your expertise, and there's a resentment there, I think, that this mixed with enormous gratitude as well. So it's quite a complicated set of emotions. Whereas the Imperial Fist, they were there the whole time, and their Primarch was the one who just would not give up. And at the times when it was darkest during the siege, Dorm was there. He was holding the line, and yet he's emerged, I think, much more broken than his brother Guilliman. And so there's a really complicated set of emotions on all sides, I think, about what's just happened. And then there are some other Imperial characters, one of which is Khalid Hassan, who is a non-Space Marine. He's a character who popped up in some Heresy books too, and he was one of the Chosen of Malcador. And now, sort of spoiler, he's no longer got his boss around, so he now has to, like everybody in this book, work out what to do next, work out how to survive, work out how to keep himself alive, and then what's he going to do, what's his objective going forward. And then on the traitor side, we have two Space Marines as well. We have a word bearer called Adrahasis, who is, I guess, within the book, he's one of the characters that really struggles with the metaphysics of the whole situation. He's a devout believer, as most word bearers are, and he's got to come to terms with the failure of the grand dream that he was so instrumental in pushing forward. And he's paired up with an Iron Warrior who has a very different perspective on the universe again, doesn't have much time for gods and Primarchs, and in the same way is coming to terms with the loss, but has very different conclusions. And of course, there's tensions there too. And there are other traitor characters that kind of orbit around those during the book. So his name is Ortag Theocon. He's a new character for the setting, and we start the book with him. He's the character that really introduced us to this world, and he's on the run like most of the traitors. He's trying to get out. They've seen the big defeat, they got very close. He got all the way to the walls of the Imperial Palace and then had to turn around. And so his journey is very much initially survival, getting away from Terra, getting out of this big disaster that's overtaken them. And then he as things go, he meets other traitors trying to do the same thing. And they start immediately to butt heads because they've got very different ideas of how to get out, what the possibilities are. It's very desperate for them. They're all in this kind of state of shock, and it's almost like a psychic shock. Some of them, other legions, have lost their Primarchs, but even these two characters who, as far as they know, haven't lost their Primarchs in time, but they're not around. They don't know where they are. And I think Theocon was a great character to write, partly because I would love to write Iron Warriors. I've not done much of that, and they're a fantastic legion with a lot of interesting history. But he was just so different than the others, so belligerent about the whole thing. He's a kind of unpleasant kind of guy, but he sees the universe fairly clearly, perhaps in ways that word bearers might not. For example, he's got quite an acute sense of kind of nonsense, and he's really a very straightforward kind of guy. And so he shows us another way of possible survival for the traitors in this period. And it's contrasted with the ways that the other characters kind of manage that. I think it's one of the things I find most interesting about Warhammer in general, the relationship between mortals and gods. And the word bearers are a great way of really kind of seeing how close that relationship can be. And he's had the worst experience, all that faith that drove them across the galaxy for 7 years has turned out to be an enormous setback. And you're thinking about what that does. Do you just junk all your ideas and say, well, they were clearly wrong? Do you cling on to them and try and make some kind of sense of what's just happened? Those are the things that really sort of matter to him. And one of the interesting features of the Scouring setting is we really thought about how to make it distinct from other eras of history. And one of the ideas that came to the fore is that actually chaos itself has slightly changed in this era because of what happened on Terra, because of Horus and the Emperor's great clash, which was really on a metaphysical plane as much as a physical one. It's not quite the same afterwards, for a little while at least. The relationship between chaos and the universe is slightly different, and everyone's got to get their heads around that. But for Wordbearers, that's as hard as anything else. And so he's got a really tough set of decisions to make. And I guess his conflict is as much about that as anything else. And of course, I guess some legions are further down the road than others, even at that time. There are some that have already taken a lot of the characteristics that we'll recognise much later. And there are some that aren't. And again, one of the interesting features of this time period is that in some respects, they roll back a bit from where they were, even in the siege. There are some aspects of the universe that make the gifts that they've accepted or the roads that they've gone on actually no longer appropriate for a bit. And you begin to think, well, maybe they could take a really severe turn away from that, and maybe there's some way back for them or some other future, because we know that actually there isn't, but they don't know that. And so getting to grips with doubt on the chaos side is really important. They've had some significant advantages up till now, that the gods were present in the universe in a very direct way. It was very easy for them to think, we are doing the gods' work and we can see the signs all around us that we're on the right path. They had a lot of success, and so their success breeds success, and they can think that this shows that we're doing the right kind of thing. In the aftermath of a big defeat, and it is a big defeat for them, and with the withdrawal of some of those certainties that they've had, they're going to have a really tough time working out what to do. And I think it'll slow down some of that process that we've already seen, that they're becoming. They've got more spikes and more skulls and all of the things that we associate with them. So there's a kind of a real sort of slowing down of that process, and then they're exploring other avenues. But of course we know where it ends up in the end, but for them, they don't. Some of the political changes that are going on, certainly on the Imperial side, where Primarchs, in many senses, have failed. The heresy is in one respect, the story of the Primarchs failing in their duties and failing in their grand project. So there are other sources of power in the universe. It's not just Primarchs. I mean, they're not absent in the sense that they do stuff, and we know that they do stuff in the Scouring. I think one of the decisions from the narrative point of view that I think is quite interesting is that they are slightly less centered than they were during the Heresy series. And this is a period on the Imperial side where non-Legion institutions really start to think, well, it's our turn now. Could we have done it better? Do we feel gratitude to the Primarchs who saved us, or do we feel that they're to blame for what happened? And so the sense that the Primarchs are no longer the only focus of this is one of the interesting parts of the book from the political side. Primarchs being Primarchs, they're not going to go away quietly, even if they thought they ought to. And so they're still very much one of the elements of this. But the changing relationships between Primarchs and the rest of the galaxy is one of the themes. So I guess that the key decisions to make then is, how are the characters that we've created with their kind of attributes and their outlook, how are they going to deal with the things that we are presenting, the challenges that we're presenting them with? It's a military campaign. The Scouring is a military campaign. How are they going to rise to the challenge of that? Is it going to be like the Heresy, where there's it doesn't go in the way they intend? Of course it will do in lots of ways. But having set up this cast of characters, it's really about how they respond to all of the things that the Scouring throws in their faces. I keep using the word privilege, and it really is, because we're conscious that people feel very strongly about the background and the lore, and that's something that we really want to look after and make sure that we try and do the best job we can with it. And one aspect of the book is the sense that this is almost history being written. Anyone who knows the Forge World Heresy books will know there's this sort of in-universe historian's voice. There's some aspects of Ashes of the Imperium that have a similar kind of tone, that this is someone looking back on those events and trying to think about how they will appear to future generations, trying to give names to certain sort of patches of that history to make sense of it from looking backward. So the idea that history is being made here was a really important theme. And the other, I guess, side of that is that I was very keen to stress over and over again that nobody in this book really knows anything very much about how things will go. They don't immediately leap to the conclusion that now we're on the journey to 40k as we know it. They don't immediately leap to recognizing that universe in the way that we recognize it. They don't know that's going to happen. And every time they encounter the sort of the real beginnings of things that we recognize much later in 40k, they don't necessarily recognize that as the future. It's one possible course. They think that things might go very differently. So that was a constant challenge for me as the author, to make sure that these people don't know too much, that they are really in the dark for most of the time. And that's, even for Space Marines, that's a really disorientating experience for them. They don't have the guidance from the top that they used to have, and they really don't know how things are going to go from there. I've always found that kind of thing interesting, the counterfactual side of the history of these events. So when I was doing the Heresy series, I wrote 2 novels with the White Scars. One of the core ideas with them is that they could have gone the other way, and that their Primarch had to deal with a lot of doubt about what was going on, and there was a real possibility that they might not have ended up as loyalist Space Marines and might have become traitors. And so even within the Heresy, where a lot more was set in stone, we had that idea that things could have gone the other way. I think with the Scouring, there's even less of that kind of certainty about where they end up. There's no end point to the Scouring in the way that there is with the Heresy that we already know about. There's a genuine chance that things could turn out very unexpectedly, and they've got a lot further to go. So you can really play with that kind of counterfactual stuff, and I think it's just a fascinating thing. What could have been, what might be, and using that space a bit more to examine all those options. But one of the differences, I guess, between the Scouring and the Heresy is that there are relatively few things that we know about already in the lore. There are some big events that happen in the Scouring which are going to be part of the series, but not very many actually. So we're inventing, I think, a bit more than we were in the Heresy. In the Heresy, we knew that we had to do Calth, we knew we had to do Prospero and all those big battles. There's more invention, I think, here, and we're sort of thinking about how some of those empty spaces in the lore could be filled. So it's a slightly different sort of feeling about that. I think but it gives us opportunities. It gives us opportunities to, I think, make the galaxy feel more populated with stuff that we really genuinely don't know about at the moment. I think it's a real challenge and a privilege, which sounds a bit of a cliche, but it is. I mean, sitting around a room with very talented people, all of whom have contributed in the past to sort of classic Heresy or Warhammer books. It's really, we do it in person now, which is great. I mean, for a few years, obviously, we weren't able to do that. And there's nothing quite like sitting around the table and just hammering those things out and throwing ideas into the room, seeing how and ideas then will get knocked around, they'll change, and they'll develop. And it is a challenge, and sometimes it can be really quite grueling, and sometimes it can be quite difficult if there are different views in the room that clash, and we've got to work through that. But the end result, it's just a thrilling kind of thing, because you can see the germ of stories, and then they get turned into things that end up going into books, and they get fully formed. And it's quite, when you look back on the process, it's almost quite emotional. You think, well, we were there right at the start, and we worked that thing out, and there's nothing really like it. It's great writing novels as an individual author, but doing it in a team has its own kind of special character. So I think what people can expect from this is a look at the entire world, of the entire galaxy of the Broken Imperium, from the very bottom to the very top, showing how every soul within that drama has to respond to the way that things have changed, and how they're going to survive, and how they're going to prosper in a galaxy that's now extremely dangerous for everybody.